Okay, so what we're going to do today is do a very in-depth psychological analysis of Chris Watts. This is based on basically a manuscript for a book that I wrote a while ago. It's a lot of words. It's probably 20,000 words. That's just that section of the manuscript of the book, just analyzing Chris Watts and Shanann Watts. But I'm just going to go through a PowerPoint that I just made. It kind of details like the main bullet points from that piece of work. If I have the opportunity to, I'll probably upload or post the full text of the thing I wrote somewhere if this gets any traction. But without further ado, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go briefly review the 5-factor model of personality, or otherwise known as Big Five, Ocean. Then we're going to look at affectivity, or his emotional expression. Then we're going to talk about his primary attachment figures, relationship with his children, friendships, early romance, marriage, decision making, Jungian stuff, in case anybody is interested in that. Then get into personality disorders, dependent personality disorder, narcissism, communal narcissism, the 3 E's of narcissism. Then we'll get into psychopathy. That'll be fun. And then we're going to talk about some myths about psychopathy and criminality. We're going to briefly look at PTSD, as well as autism spectrum disorder, ASD. So that's what we're going to do. So let's go ahead and get started with the 5-factor model, Ocean. So what I determined in my analysis is that Chris Watts is low in extroversion. This is pretty obvious. We know that he is not a center of attention. He doesn't have a lot of friends. But a counterexample of his obvious introversion is when he spent so much of his free time after work with Nicole Kessinger during the affair. That's pretty inconsistent with introversion, because typically we would expect that person to need to withdraw from others. But it did appear as though he was spending basically all of his free time with that other person. But this is probably more in line with just basic limerence rather than an actual reflection of his inner personality. So general intelligence / conscientiousness, how smart is he? How organized is he? How effectively is he able to make things happen that he wants through intellect and organization? What I determined is that he's very high in mechanical intelligence. He has worked in multiple industries that require, high mechanical competence. He used to be a auto mechanic, and at the time of the murders, he was an oil mechanic. And he, according to the discovery, according to his coworkers, appeared to be very useful in that job, and was not. Nobody reported that he was dumb, stupid, and it is a pretty complicated field, so it's probably reasonable to conclude that he's at least average, maybe above average in mechanical competence. But in other areas of intelligence, it really depends on which theory of intelligence that you subscribe to. But like if you're talking about Gardner or something like that, like emotional intelligence, that's probably lower, because he has a lot of difficulty displaying his emotion, getting things that he wants in the relationship with Shanann. And he doesn't, spend a lot of time dealing with emotions, which is all the reasons why I would say he's probably maybe lower than normal. Not lower than normal, but lower than average in, emotional intelligence. And because of the roles that he did not take up in the marriage relationship, it appears to be reasonable to say to say that he may not have been average in like financial intelligence and like basic law because of the way he behaved with the police during the triple homicide investigation. Doesn't appear to have the great decision making, but like it says here, it's unclear if this is from personality or if this is from intellectual deficit. So is this coming from his high agreeableness, his lack of participating in decision making in the relationship? Is that coming from his high agreeableness, or is that coming from a deficiency in intelligence? I don't know. So the next one, agreeableness, is very high, appears to be very high. Some people would call this a type 9 Enneagram, which is someone who's very agreeable, who likes to keep the peace in tense situations and avoids conflict. So evidence for this is both partners, both Shanann and Chris, both claimed that their marriage was fight-free, that they never had any real fights. The only real fight they ever had was when Shanann got super upset about him seeing a girl pretty early on in their relationship. So that's evidence of high agreeableness, specifically because we know that Shanann was very dominant, so this indicates that if you have one really dominant person in the relationship and there's no fights, that means the other person is probably pretty submissive. And, you know, submissiveness is probably going to be pretty well correlated with agreeableness. So the next one, neuroticism, appears to be quite low, and that's primarily because of his behavior in prison. I looked into the discovery and found a lot of notes from prison guards who were documenting his behavior in his prison cell, and they never documented anywhere that I could find that he was demonstrating any depression or any suicidality or any negative feelings whatsoever. They didn't report him crying, they didn't report him wailing, they didn't report him yelling. All of the reports appeared to be consistently saying that he just sat in his cell, read his Bible, I believe, and was very polite. That is not, I don't work in a prison, haven't read research on prison behavior, but I would imagine that under the circumstances he was in, that is not normal. It would be much more normal to have, a lot of emotional trauma going on that's going to be more visible that guards might take note of. But I haven't seen the research on that. This is just speculation. So I would say that neuroticism does appear to be low, as also because the way he presented himself in the phone calls he made to his family that were posted on the internet. He presented himself in a very positive way. We didn't see a lot of negativity. We didn't see a lot of neuroticism. He presented himself in a pretty not joyful, but in a pretty positive way. He wasn't crying. He wasn't upset. He didn't seem depressed. I say he wasn't, but he didn't seem that way at all. And you certainly would expect to see at least some of that when he's in that kind of situation, and we didn't see that. So that's why I say he's probably pretty low in neuroticism, because people who would be high or average in neuroticism, you would expect a lot of negative feelings to be coming up to the surface. Okay, so is affectivity. So by affectivity, I mean your emotional expression. How do you present yourself emotionally with your face, and with your tone of voice? Do you speak in a super monotonous tone, or do you have a tone that's like really lively that people like to listen to? And do you use your face a lot to express emotions? And if you do, are those emotions normal? Are they what we would expect with the emotions you're giving, or are they more consistent with someone who's pretending to experience those emotions? So what I've determined is that Chris does appear to have a slightly blunted affect. That means that he has a fairly normal presentation of affect, but it is a little bit less than what you might expect to see in an average person. That means, he's not as emotionally responsive as most people would be. But this does appear to be consistent with the typical male upbringing in most cultures, like American culture, obviously. It is normal for men to be raised in a place where they're taught that you can't show emotion if you're a man. Emotion is weakness. And that may or may not have been at play in his childhood, but we do know that his father acted and has a similar affect, so we can reasonably conclude that this slightly blunted affect is probably related to his upbringing, and it's probably not reasonable to conclude that this is due to internal personality deficits. So what we do know is that there is some slight social awkwardness when he's like on the Facebook Lives, when he is talking. God, can't talk. So what we do know is that there is some slight social awkwardness when he's, for example, on the Facebook Lives with Shanann in most of the videos. There's some social awkwardness that, maybe intermixing with this blunted affect might be causing each other, might not be, we don't really know. But what is notable is that he did demonstrate pretty normal affect in the first confession at the police station when he tells the story where Shanann killed the kids and then he retaliated. When he's giving that confession over that 2-hour long period, his affect is very normal. Gets a lot of crap for crying about what his coworkers are going to think of him, but psychologically, his behavior, his affect, the way he cries, the way he sobs, the way he swears, this is all very normal for these circumstances. So, what did he do at the police station? He was sobbing, he was yelling, he was crying, excessive profanity, repetition of phrases. This is all normal and is not exactly consistent with a truly blunted or flat affect. So we can conclusively rule out flat affect. And, with the blunted affect, you can certainly obviously see normal affect. It's just in the baseline, it's blunted, but, it can be more normal in the more abnormal circumstances, which is what we see. So that is consistent with what we expect. And I will say a word about the excessive profanity that I just mentioned, because the only time Chris has ever sworn on camera, the only time he has ever used profanity on camera in any recordings that I've seen that I remember, the only time he does that is during that first confession at the jail. That is interesting because high uses of profanity is associated with honesty. So when you're really truly upset about something, your filter's going to come off, right? You might start swearing when you otherwise wouldn't be. He's at a police station, he's with professionals. You normally wouldn't, in most circumstances, resort to foul language when you're around professionals, at least most people don't. And our baseline of Chris says that Chris does not. We don't have any other evidence of him swearing ever in any circumstance except for this one unique circumstance when he's telling that first confession story. So that is important, but not necessarily to this psychological analysis. So another minor note on the affectivity, the slightly blunted affect could have a genetic link since the father appears to present similarly. So, primary attachment figures. What we've learned by looking at and listening to the phone calls he made with his family in prison, or I think that was actually in the jail, Weld County Jail. We learned that he is capable of meaningful emotional engagement with father, mother, and sister per these phone calls. So he does appear to have some sentimentality towards his family, which is great. appeared to be more distant with mother more than others, but this may have been a result of poor affective mirroring on her part. So what I noticed was that he didn't appear to be as emotionally engaged with his mother, and what I noticed was that his mother was very emotionally expressive, and what I believe was happening was Chris sort of shuts down when he's exposed to someone who is really emotionally expressive. This is pretty normal behavior. When your psychological baseline is super chill, you don't really use a lot of emotions on your face, you're not super expressive. When you come up and meet someone who is like in your face, who is like really emotional, is on the verge of tears, or is super happy, you're not going to mesh very well with that person, because your affectivity is not mirroring very well. We communicate best with people who match our own psychological experience, right? So I think that's what was happening. His mother has very high emotional affectivity, has very expressive emotions, and Chris doesn't. And because she is not sort of taming down those emotions when talking to Chris, I think that might be what's causing some of this social disconnect between them. What I also noticed was that he bonded with his father over mutual discomfort for serious subjects by comically talking about sports, and that seemed to be a family joke. It appears as though there is a long-standing pattern where Chris and his dad just talk about sports when they know that they should be talking about more serious things, and that seemed to be a running joke within the family. Like at the end of the calls, they would say, talk to your dad for the last 10 seconds about sports, and then we'll hang out because we have to hang out. So, this is, it's not normal, but it's certainly not pathological. It's just sort of a little bit slightly off what, how most people would behave, but it's nothing pathological. It's just a quirky family. What I also noted was that he appeared to have a particularly authentic, genuine connection with his sister. If you listen to that phone call, I think you will find that it seems truly authentic. And Chris also once claimed somewhere, I'm not sure where, he also claimed that his sister took on a more motherly role in his early life. So that's noteworthy, that's interesting. Okay, so moving on to his relationship with children. He appears to be the primary caregiver. I say that because he appears in the Facebook records to have been the one who drove them to daycare in the morning, who packed their lunches, and also picked them up after the school day was over. And he also appeared to have intimate knowledge of their daily routines. I could only find one single instance where he spoke to either of the two girls with a negative raised voice, and that was in a Facebook video where he had Bella on his shoulders and she was leaning too far over, causing him to get off balance, almost fall over. That was the only time I've ever been able to find where Chris was talking to the girls in an even slightly negative manner. All other instances of his communication with his children appear to be very positive, very reassuring, and very empathetic. He appears to give his children his undivided attention at all times, and he appears to be attentive to their practical and emotional needs at all times. So when you look at all the video evidence of how he raised his children, there are no red flags, there are no orange flags, there's no yellow flags. He appears to be a very good father by all evidence. I mean, he gives them his full and undivided attention at all times, it seems like. So, that is important evidence. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Chris's friendships. So friends and acquaintances throughout his life have reportedly never had a single negative thing to say about him, according to police. So all the friends who have come forward, all of his acquaintances that have come forward and have been interviewed by police, they have never had anything negative to say about Chris Watts. So not many friends. So Chris doesn't have a lot of friends, but this is normal for those higher introversion levels. When you're more introverted, you're probably not going to have as many friends. So, this is very normal, but the number of friends that he has is not so low that it would be clinically relevant, in my opinion. Because, he has, I think, 2 or 3 primary friends. That's normal for, someone who's introverted. If he was super, super extroverted, that might be abnormally low. But for someone who's introverted like Chris and has all of Shanann's friends around him all the time, that's very normal. There's nothing to see there. He was consistently being invited to outings with Shanann. And, he never showed any clear significant social deficits apart from just being awkward. So yeah, there was some social awkwardness, in the Facebook Live videos when he was interacting with some of the people at, on the cruise, on the big boat, at these resorts that they used to go to. But none of this is clinically relevant. This is all consistent with introversion. And, we're going to get into some stuff later on, but this is not clinically relevant. So real briefly, his early romance in high school era, college era. So virtually none to speak of. This is abnormal for that era in time, for that generation. But, not as much nowadays is what I've heard. So slightly abnormal, but, not much can be extrapolated from this, but it goes into the evidence basket. So very low romance in early childhood. Not early childhood, but in the time where you would expect to see some. So this is interesting. Could indicate a lot of things, we don't really know what. So now we're getting to his marriage with Shanann, his only true long-lasting romantic relationship. So this relationship appeared to be stable across time with little to no clear evidence of affairs, excessive fighting, or clinically relevant maladaptive behaviors in Chris that would have resulted from unhealthy marriage. So when we look at this marriage across time, we don't see a lot of obvious examples of volatility. We don't see the fights, we don't see the divorces, we don't see affairs, at least none that we have clear evidence of. And the way both of them report their marriage, they both seem to agree with this basic sentiment that it was a pretty happy marriage, pretty stable marriage. So it does appear as though in this marriage, this was Shanann's world and Chris was living in it, so she's very clearly the dominant personality. We can see that in basically all of the Facebook Live videos, and we can also kind of see that the way he behaves around her appears to be pretty submissive. There is fairly conclusive evidence that Shanann acts in a consistently demeaning manner towards Chris. This isn't about Shanann yet, but it is noteworthy to say that Chris was likely being demeaned by Shanann in a regular manner, and yet we still don't have a long pattern of fights and of affairs on Chris's behalf that we have clear evidence of. So that is a point towards his high agreeableness. So a final note on the marriage. There is a lack of quality affective mirroring between the two. This appears to be significant and pervasive. So again, what I mean by that affective mirroring is, are these two people on the same emotional wavelength? Are they emoting in more or less the same way? When we look at this marriage, the answer appears to be no. Shanann is extremely emotionally expressive, Chris not so much. What we see particularly in some text messages is Chris kind of mirrors Shanann's way of texting, right? The way Chris types his text messages to Shanann is not consistent with how he talks. So that's evidence that he's sort of mirroring her semantics, basically, her way of typing, to sort of get on that same page, to sort of get on that same wavelength. A lot of people say, a lot of people point to that and say, oh, that's evidence of narcissism, but we'll get to that later. In my opinion, this is just normal. It's someone who's trying to get on the same wavelength and is trying to talk to the person the way that they want to be talked to. And that's not pathological, at least not necessarily. And when you have that consistent, pervasive lack of quality affective mirroring, you can, it's probably safe to guess that there might be some cracks in the marriage, because you kind of need to be on the same emotional wavelength as your partner if you're going to be with them this whole time. Yeah, I'm not an expert on that, so we'll go to the next one. So briefly, some Jungian stuff, Jungian typology, his cognitive typology. I'll briefly go into that, specifically the judging versus feeling. If you're subscribed to that, that's great. So he appears to be on the feeling side rather than the thinking side, for whatever that's worth. And that's because he reportedly chased Shanann in an overly passionate manner. So what I mean by that is, so Carl Jung wrote a book and he said that there are two types of people, right? One type of person is a thinker and one type of person is a feeler. The thinker makes decisions primarily based on logic, and the feeler makes decisions primarily based on emotion. So we have thinkers and feelers. That's what I'm talking about. And I'm saying that he appears to be slightly on the feeling side, so he primarily makes decisions based on emotion. But it's not necessarily science. There's not a lot of research backing up whether or not people actually fit onto those sides of the line, so to speak. So he appears to be controlled by emotional fear of conflict, which is, I guess, interesting. He regularly demonstrates high degree of cognitive and emotional empathy towards his daughters. That's pretty interesting. He became highly emotionally driven during the affair, but I'm unsure if limerence affects thinkers differently than feelers, because again, this isn't really scientific. This is just for the people who subscribe to that. So a quick word about personality. So now we're going to slowly work our way into personality disorders. So, contrary to popular belief, personality only makes up a small percentage of our daily behavior as humans, and the rest is dictated by human processes that we all share. When we perceive someone to have done a monstrous thing, we as humans tend to assume that the person's personality is to blame for the behavior, and we tend to assume they did not act the way they did because of psychological processes we as humans all share. So what that means is, when we see someone do something really horrible, we tend to assume that the thing that caused them to do that is not inside of us, right? There's a monstrous aspect of that person's brain that is only in that person's brain. So if it were a line of code, I don't have that same line of code in my head. I would never do that. That's what we as humans tend to think. And what I'm saying is that this is not wise, because a lot of bad behavior, a lot of human behavior in general, is not dictated by personality, as we tend to assume, but is dictated by natural human processes that we all share, because we share a lot of DNA with each other. So next one, now we're going into personality disorders. So what I've been taught is that it is very difficult for even licensed clinicians, not necessarily psychologists, but people with master's degrees in licensed marriage family therapist. What's another one? LPCs, therapists, clinicians who aren't necessarily psychologists tend to have a lot of difficulty with delineating these complex personality disorders, because personality disorders in particular, not bipolar mood disorder, not depression, not schizophrenia, well, schizophrenia is actually a pretty interesting thing, so I shouldn't say that. But personality disorders in particular tend to be very difficult for clinicians to consistently diagnose accurately. That's the point. So personality disorders, specifically cluster B personality disorders, not so much cluster C and A. These cluster B personality disorders negatively impact the way we relate towards other people. That's why it's called personality disorder. Personality tends to be how we relate to other people. This isn't about internal mood. This is about how do I feel about that person. So a really important thing to understand here is the difference between like a subclinical personality defect and a full-blown clinical disorder, clinical personality disorder. These are two very different things. A full-blown clinical personality disorder is someone who is bleeding out on the floor. This person is very unhealthy. This person has experienced extreme distress in their daily life. That is a full-blown clinical personality disorder. It's very debilitating, okay? When you have something less than that, you might expect to see someone who has slight difficulties here and there, but for the most part, they're okay. So that's the difference between subclinical stuff that's not as serious and full-blown clinical personality disorder. When you're going to say you're going to diagnose this person with narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, what you're saying is that they are extremely maladaptive in their daily behaviors, that they are basically bleeding out on the floor, because that's what that terminology means. So we need to be careful about that. Full-blown clinical personality disorders are very rare. A person must be experiencing severe distress. Think, is this person bleeding out on the floor, or it is but a scratch? So if you watched my other video about basic diagnostics, does the unicorn just have a bunch of scratches in it, or is it exploding in flames? And does it have blood squirting out of it? That's the difference that we need to keep in mind whenever we throw around labels like X personality disorder, Y personality disorder. These are very serious conditions. So the first one we're going to talk about, not a lot of people talk about, is dependent personality disorder, and with regards to Chris. Chris's behavior at times appears to be consistent with the general archetype of dependent personality disorder, but a more detailed analysis appears to reveal this is less likely a clinical personality disorder, but is more likely a normal response to threatening stimuli, i.e. dominant women. So one of the first things I noticed when I did my first analysis of this case psychologically was that Chris was acting in a way that made him appear to be unable to perform basic tasks. He appeared to be insufficient, basically. Shanann was doing a lot of basic tasks for him. He was having Shanann do a lot of stuff for him that most people would do by themselves. And there were a few other indicators that were kind of consistent with dependent personality disorder, and some of the ways he was talking with and behaving around Nicole Kessinger appeared to be consistent with this archetype. And this archetype of dependent personality disorder is someone who feels like they can cope with not having the emotional support they need by making themselves appear as though they need help. So they have a fear of being sufficient. They don't want to be good enough. They feel like the only way they're going to get emotional support is if they appear helpless. If I'm helpless, if I can't do anything myself, then other people will come give me the emotional support I need and the practical support I need. So I thought I was seeing that behavior in Chris, but then I started seeing some indicators that were pointing in the opposite direction. So at work, he was a very capable employee, and he had a pattern of sort of going out on his own and figuring stuff out for himself in terms of like living situation and going to college, going to school by himself. And the key piece of evidence was when he moved out of his home after graduating high school, he never came back for support from his parents, but his sister did. So that seemed to be pretty clear evidence against him actually having this personality disorder, or really even being on the spectrum, because someone with that disorder, or someone who's significantly on that spectrum, you would expect them to be going back home for support a lot. You would expect them to have to be pushed away from their home because they need that support, right? Or they want to have that support. That's how they get their emotional support, is through practical support from others. And they have a lot of difficulty taking on new responsibilities. So that's why I don't think he is necessarily experiencing an innate personality disorder, but instead he is probably reacting more to dominant women in his life. And I believe this might be a fawn response, not necessarily like a super traumatic response, but in trauma we have the four main responses. Most people know about the first two: fight or flight, and then you have freeze, and then you have fawn. So freeze is when you just stand, you play dead like a possum, and then fawn is when you try to appease the attacker,